News of the Times, the Meader case, the death of Mabel Meader and the Marshall Hall defence. True crime from 1922. Today, we're stepping into a case that shocked Edwardian Britain, not because of its violence, but because of what the courts believed caused it. This is the story of Mabel Meader, found dead after a struggle inside her home in 1922, and of her husband, Alfred Meader, a blind ex-soldier who survived a dramatic attempt on his own life just moments later. What followed baffled doctors, divided the press, and brought one of the most famous defence barristers in British history, Sir Edward Marshall Hall, into a courtroom fight unlike any other. Because this case has everything: a marriage under strain, a fatal confrontation, an extraordinary medical twist, and a detail that surprises almost everyone. Was Mabel's death murder, or was it a tragic accident? Or did medical science and the law itself misunderstand what truly happened in that room? Tonight we explore the Meader case, the death of Mabel Meader and the Marshall Hall defence. Before we finish, a quick dip into the stranger corners of British lawmaking, those moments when Parliament turned its attention away from crime and justice and focused instead on hairstyles and livestock placement. Yes, truly, at various points, Britain attempted to regulate how girls under 16 should wear their hair, and how far a pig must stand from a London street. Proof, if nothing else, that the nation's legislative energy had never been confined purely to matters of life and death. And if all of this sounds like your cup of tea, suitably brewed, placed at the correct angle upon a freshly starched doily on a round teak side table, do consider giving us a like, or even a hype, if you can trace down that elusive creature. You might even share this episode with that anatomical enthusiast in your life. You know the one. And with that, we slip back into an age when Sir Marshall Hall bestrode the courtrooms of England, and the outcome of a trial could hinge on a single, impeccably delivered sentence. Post-war world. The early 1920s were a time caught between two worlds. Millions of soldiers returned home from the Great War to streets that looked familiar, but lives that no longer felt the same. Many carried invisible wounds, shell shock, shattered nerves, and a kind of exhaustion for which there was no proper name. Blindness, amputations, damaged lungs, ruined hearing. The physical toil was plain enough, but the inner traumas often ran deeper still. Waiting at home were wives and sweethearts who had lived through a very different war. With men at the front, women had worked, earned wages, run households, and discovered freedoms and competencies Victorian society had never encouraged them to see in themselves. But peace brought with it an abrupt governmental insistence that women step down, give up their wartime jobs, and allow men to reassume their rightful place in the workforce. Newspapers of the day frequently echoed this pressure, and women who hesitated or who preferred the independence they had gained were often criticised in print as unfeminine, disloyal, or destabilising to the social order. The result was a nation negotiating uneasy ground, a generation of women who knew they could stand on their own feet, and a generation of men who desperately hoped life might return to what it had been before, and who often felt threatened or diminished when it did not. It was a time of shifting expectations, new tensions, and domestic readjustments in every household, from London to the smallest rural lane. A world where courage, strain, pride and resentment and quiet desperation lived under the same roof. Alfred and Mabel Meader. In the midst of this unsettling post-war Britain lived the Meaders. Alfred, a blind ex-soldier who had once marched confidently across foreign fields, now navigating London with the help of charitable organisations, and Mabel, a young woman described variously as warm, affectionate, quick-tempered, and increasingly restless. Before the war, theirs had been a happy marriage by all accounts, but like so many couples of their generation, peace had brought not stability, but strain. Alfred, suddenly dependent on others for the simplest tasks, leaned heavily on Mabel for mobility, support, and the daily guidance that blindness demanded. Mabel, meanwhile, had begun to slip into the blurred edges of another life. She was using the alias Maisie Carter, receiving letters from other men, and already left the marriage once before. Their 5-year-old daughter, Irene, was staying in a home during this period of upheaval, a quiet sign of how far tensions had risen inside the household. What emerges is not a story of villains and saints, but of two people caught between exhaustion, jealousy, uncertainty, and poverty. A marriage bending under the pressures neither had been prepared for. It is a small domestic world, cramped, claustrophobic, where emotional weight builds quietly day after day until something gives way. From the Daily Herald, the 13th of July, 1922. Husband cuts his throat in the street. An exciting incident which led to a tragic discovery occurred in Boundaries Road, a busy Balham thoroughfare, yesterday afternoon. A man who is practically blind attempted, it is stated, to take his own life by cutting his throat outside the Balham Hotel. His name is Richard Meader, and his age is given at 26. It appears that he has just left the hotel when he was seen to be cutting his throat. He was at once surrounded and the police summoned. Police discovery. The police, in consequence of a statement made by Meader, it is said, went to a house in Boundaries Road. They forced an entry and found Meader's wife, who is also about 26, in an unconscious state. Mrs. Meader died soon after admission to St James's Infirmary. Meader was also taken to the infirmary and detained. His condition is understood is not regarded as critical. A neighbour of the Meaders stated that the first she knew that anything was wrong was when the police came to her house and asked to be allowed to climb over the garden fence before going to the window of the next door house. What followed was as grim as it was unexpected. Not only were the police called to detain Alfred Meader for the crime of attempting to take his own life, an offence in 1922, but the few words he managed to utter in the street sent officers hurrying to his home. Forced entry revealed a second tragedy. Mabel Meader lying inside beyond help by the time she reached St James's Infirmary. In trying to end his own life, Meader had pointed the authorities towards a far deeper calamity behind his own front door. Suicide and the law in 1922. In 1922 England, suicide was not treated as a medical crisis or a sign of emotional collapse. It was treated as a criminal act. The law held that a person who attempted to take their own life had committed a misdemeanour, punishable by imprisonment, fines, or both. The reasoning came from older religious and moral frameworks. Life was considered something owed to the king, and to attempt to end it was viewed as a breach of duty rather than a cry for help. Those who survived an attempt could therefore expect to be arrested, questioned, and charged, and any statements made in the immediate aftermath, however confused or panicked, could be used as evidence in other investigations, particularly where foul play was suspected. It was not until 1961, almost 40 years later, that England and Wales finally decriminalised suicide. But in 1922, when Alfred Meader was stopped bleeding in the street outside the Balham Hotel, the police were obliged to treat him first and foremost as a criminal suspect, not as a patient. It was in this climate, where a man who survived a suicide attempt could find himself in handcuffs rather than hospital care, that the full weight of the Meader tragedy now began to unfold. Once Alfred Meader was secured and his initial statements noted, attention turned to the house in Boundaries Road and, inevitably, to the woman whose life had ended there. The authorities moved quickly. An inquest was convened, witnesses were summoned, and the press descended with the curious mixture of solemnity and sensational appetite that characterized the reporting of the day. What emerged at that inquest would shape the public understanding of the case, cast a harsh light on the Meaders' marriage, and reveal attitudes towards women that now feel uncomfortably stark. As the Daily Mirror reported next, the coroner was not merely examining the evidence, he was already forming judgments. From the Daily Mirror, the 15th of July, 1922, war-blinded man in wife murder charge. New light was thrown on the Balham tragedy involving an ex-patient of St Dunstan's hostel and his wife at the inquest on the woman at Battersea yesterday. The woman, Mrs Mabel Frances Meader, was found dying in her home at Boundaries Road in Balham, having apparently been strangled, and the husband, it is alleged, afterwards cut his throat. A verdict of wilful murder against the husband was returned. Miss Catherine Amelia Merry, the dead woman's mother, said that her daughter married Meader, who was an ex-soldier, in 1916, and they had one child, now 5 years old. Her daughter left Meader in January, said Mrs Merry, on account of him knocking her about. She stated that she had seen Meader the worse for drink several times. Then came the testimony that electrified the courtroom. Mabel's mother stepped forward and, with steadiness that seemed to catch even the coroner by surprise, alleged that Alfred Meader was not blind as he claimed, that he had on more than one occasion raised his spectacles to comment on a passing woman's dress, and that he could see sufficiently when it suited him. In her view, his blindness had become convenient, a means to secure charitable assistance from St Dunstan's and, more importantly, to maintain his disability pension, the one financial anchor the family possessed. The implication was clear, that the degree of his impairment and the degree to which he relied upon it publicly were not always the same. This accusation landed heavily in a post-war Britain, where pensions for injured servicemen were both vital lifelines and sources of bitter scrutiny. Fraud in this area was taken extremely seriously, viewed as a particularly heinous offence in a country still staggering under the human and financial cost of the war. An accusation of pension deception was enough to make an inquest room sit up sharply and listen. From the Daily Express, the 15th of July, 1922. Lonely blind man. Can Meader see? His mother-in-law's theory. Everything suggests that a grim and awful struggle took place in the room, said the Battersea coroner yesterday, at the inquest on Mrs Mabel Frances Meader, who was found dead in her home in Boundaries Road, Balham, on Wednesday. Mrs. Meader died from strangulation, and her husband, Alfred Arthur Meader, was yesterday accused of murdering her and was remanded at the South Western Police Court. Meader, an ex-soldier, is reported to be blind, but the mother of the dead woman suggested at the inquest that he could see although he wore glasses in order to retain his pension. Mrs. Catherine Amelia Merry of Holloway, Mrs. Meader's mother, said that at the inquest that her daughter and Meader were married at Christmas in 1916. They had one child, and they lived happily when they were first married. Mrs. Meader left her husband in January because he knocked her about, said Mrs. Merry. She added that she had seen her daughter several times recently, but her daughter would not let her know where she was living. A fortnight ago, Meader came to her and wanted to know if his wife would go back to him. She told him his wife refused to go back because he knocked her about. Meader gave her the address of the child at Hastings, and she gave it to her daughter. She confirmed that she had seen him the worse for drink several times, and she confirmed that he had used threats against her daughter. Said he could see. Witness continued, he said one day when a young woman was passing my door that he did not like her dress. He raised his glasses and said he could see sufficiently to see his wife anywhere. Mrs. Merry added that Meader told her that if it were not for his wife and child, he would not have to wear his glasses. He was referring to his pension. With that stunning accusation from Mabel's mother hanging in the air, the inquest shifted sharply. Attention now turned to the character of the victim herself, the state of the marriage, and crucially to Meader's own words in the moments after his arrest, statements that would weigh heavily on the inquest jury's mind. From the Daily Mirror, the 15th of July, 1922. War-blinded man in wife murder charge. Inquest verdict against lonely London ex-soldier. Evidence of quarrels. Story of dead woman's pose as a single girl. James Randall, a bootmaker of Boundaries Road, Balham, said Meader had spoken to him about his wife's conduct and complained about her not coming home at night. Randall added that Meader said to him, "I'll spoil her face so that no one else will take a fancy to her and she will be glad to stay at home." Margaret Halls, who had rooms at the Meader's house, said that at noon on Wednesday she heard Meader and his wife quarrelling violently and shouting at one another. At 10 minutes to 1, the noise stopped and all was quiet. And at 10 minutes past 2, someone went out. Hotel scene. Grace Blackmore, a barmaid at the Balham Hotel, said that Meader came into the bar on Wednesday and had a glass of ale. Suddenly, she saw him put his hand to his throat from which blood was coming. Sergeant Waller said that Meader was very excited and shouted, "I hope she's dead. I shan't hang for it." Afterwards he said, "If she is dead, I ain't sorry for it. She wanted some money and upset me and I strangled her." He was not drunk, added the witness, but had been drinking. Enough of this life. Another officer said that Meader handed him a wallet saying, "There is enough in there to justify me doing her in." Among the papers in the wallet was a yellow envelope bearing the words, "Mr. Arthur Robert Meader. Please look after my child at St Dunstan's. I've had enough of this life." Charles Richardson, a tailor and a friend of Meader, said he saw him in the public house after he'd cut his throat. Meader said, "I've done the old woman in at last. I know that you've always loved little Irene, and she has always loved you. I want you to look after her." Ida Frederick, an apartment housekeeper, of Lichfield Street, Charing Cross Road, said the dead woman, who she knew as Maisie Carter, and another young woman took a furnished room at her house on June the 20th. Divisional Detective Inspector Barrett said he found letters to Mrs. Meader written in affectionate terms from some men who addressed her as my dear Marmee and my darling Marmee. Witness added that Meader was discharged from the army in 1916 after being gassed. He went blind. Since then, he had been looked after by St Dunstan's, who first taught him mat making and then set him up in business. Dr. McTormack, superintendent of St James's Infirmary in Balham, said death was due to asphyxia caused by pressure on the neck and strangulation. On Tuesday, Mrs. Meader came and called her husband out of Randall's shop. He came back about 2 hours afterwards. He was greatly changed, said Randall. In the morning he was more himself, and after that he was greatly upset. He said, "She had not done it to me now. She is going to get possession of the child. I have tried to get her to go home, but she says she won't come home any more." The coroner, addressing the jury, said the unhappiness was the woman's own fault. He stated, "The wife, who should have cherished and looked after Meader and the child, went off with another man." He added, "Meader was distressed by her threat to take away his little girl and his hopeless dread of being without wife or child or sight." The jury returned a verdict of willful murder against Meader. The coroner's summing up left little doubt as to where his sympathies lay. Long before the jury retired, he had already framed the narrative. A suffering ex-soldier, abandoned, threatened, and driven to desperation by a wayward wife. In doing so, he cast Mabel not as a victim, but as the architect of her own fate, and placed the weight of the marriage unhappiness squarely upon her shoulders. It was a view entirely in keeping with the attitudes of the day, but one that allowed scarcely any space for nuance or complexity in a household already strained to breaking point. By the time the jury returned their verdict of willful murder, the lines had been firmly drawn for them. From the Illustrated Police News, the 20th of July, 1922, blind ex-soldier alleged to have strangled his wife, accused in court. St Dunstan's will provide for his defence. Sufficiently recovered from his slight injuries, Meader was able to attend the South Western Court, where he was charged with the murder of his wife by strangulation. He was further accused of attempting to commit suicide. Meader was closely attended by 2 policemen who carefully led him into the dock and stood close by him during the proceedings. He wore darkly shaded spectacles and carried his bowler hat in his hand. There was a bandage around his neck on which only slight wounds were visible. Detective Inspector Bennett gave evidence that early in the day he arrested Meader at St James's Infirmary and told him what he would be charged with. It is understood that St Dunstan's have decided that in view of the tremendous handicap of his lack of sight, the state of his health, and other conditions imposed upon him, that it is their duty to give Meader every reasonable assistance. They have therefore instructed a firm of solicitors to conduct the defence. Meader would now stand trial for the murder of his wife, and in the days that followed, considerable sympathy gathered around him in the press. He was not the first ex-soldier damaged by the Great War to return home only to find that the life he had once known had shifted beyond recognition. To many readers, his plight felt emblematic: blindness, poverty, domestic fracture, and a sense of slipping helplessly through the cracks of a country still trying to right itself. St Dunstan's, the charity that had supported him since his injury reacted with indignation at the notion of a blinded serviceman being charged with such a crime. They pledged to fund his defence in full and in what they viewed as the only appropriate response to the accusation, secured the services of the era's most formidable courtroom advocate, Sir Marshall Hall, a man whose mere appearance in the trial could tilt the atmosphere in the dock. Sir Edward Marshall Hall, the great defender. Sir Edward Marshall Hall, 1858 to 1927, was, by the early 1920s, the most celebrated defence barrister in Britain, a man whose mere presence in a courtroom could change the complexion of a trial. Known as a great defender, he possessed a singular ability to sway juries through a combination of theatrical flair, emotional intelligence, and a near instinctive grasp of human weakness. By this stage of his career, Marshall Hall had defended hundreds of clients, and contemporary legal writers estimated that he secured acquittals in roughly 70% of the cases where a full defence was mounted, an astonishing rate for capital trials in an era when the death penalty loomed over most murder charges. His victories included some of the most high-profile and improbable acquittals of the Edwardian and post-war decades, cementing his reputation as the barrister called upon when all seemed lost. He was not merely a lawyer, but a phenomenon, a courtroom presence whose defence speeches were so compelling that newspapers frequently printed them in full the following morning. To the public, Marshall Hall represented the last best hope of the accused. To the legal establishment, he was both admired and feared for his ability to turn a hopeless case into a moral drama that juries felt compelled to resolve in favour of mercy. For St Dunstan's, to secure Sir Marshall Hall for Alfred Meader was therefore no small gesture. It was a declaration that they believed not only in Meader's service and sacrifice, but in his innocence, and were prepared to enlist the most formidable legal champion of the age to prove it. From the Daily Herald, the 8th of September, 1922, blind ex-soldier not guilty. Meader acquitted at the Old Bailey. Pathetic story. Arthur Meader, the blind ex-soldier who was yesterday found not guilty at the Old Bailey, was where he stood his trial on charges of wife murder and attempted suicide. Although Mr. Travers Humphreys described the case as sordid and without romance, there was a hushed air of interest when Meader, a good-looking young fellow at 26, his affliction indicated in heavy blue glasses, was led across the dock by a warder. He pleaded not guilty in a firm voice. Mr. Travis Humphreys, reciting the case for the prosecution, said Meader and his wife had one child, Irene, and they lived in Boundaries Road in Balham. The wife leaves him. Meader was taken away for his health by St Dunstan's, and on his return he and his wife had frequent quarrels. She left him in the early part of the summer, taking rooms as a single woman in the name of Maisie Carter, and letters found in her handbag indicated that she was leading a dreadful life. Meader was anxious for his wife to come back to him, and both he and his wife wanted possession of the child. On July the 12th, she went to Meader's house, and the neighbour heard sounds of violent quarrelling. In the course of that quarrel, she came to her death, being found suffocated. Medical evidence. As the trial unfolded, Sir Marshall Hall shifted the focus away from character and quarrels and towards something far more technical and far more unusual. If the prosecution wished to rely on Meader's own words, the defence would rely on the body itself and on the possibility that Mabel Meader had been far more physically vulnerable than anyone realised. It was here that the medical evidence took an unexpected turn. The thymus evidence. Sir Leonard McCormack, medical superintendent of St James's Infirmary, testified that Mabel's thymus gland weighed 1¾ ounces, a significant abnormality, and in a healthy woman of 24, he explained, the thymus should have shrunk to almost nothing, but in rare cases it fails to regress, leaving what doctors of the day called a persistent or enlarged thymus. Such individuals, he told the court, could die from a level of pressure, shock, or struggle that an ordinary person would survive. In extreme cases, even intense fear or emotional excitement might be enough to stop the heart. To reinforce this point, the defence called Dr. John Lee, who described recorded instances in which people with enlarged thymus glands had died suddenly and without significant external violence, their bodies essentially overwhelmed by a surge of emotion rather than injury. The implication was unmistakable. Mabel Meader's death might not have required deliberate or prolonged strangulation at all. Only a moment of struggle, panic, or force, far less than the prosecution claimed. Meader's own story. Meader, who was assisted by a warder to the witness box, gave evidence, the judge allowing him to be seated. He said that he had been a miner and was blinded by a shell explosion while serving in the army. St Dunstan's taught him mat making and gave him a stock of confectionery to start a little shop. His wife was to look after this while he did mat making. Owing to her neglect of the shop, he sold up and went to Brighton. She pawned her wedding ring and they had trouble at Brighton. On their return, they went to live with his brother, who had also been blinded in the war. She left him and went to Southend, where she pawned his signet ring. To Edward Marshall Hall. When did you first know for certain she was carrying on with other men? Meader responded, in January 1922. Meader broke down in telling of his love for his child, whom he bathed and dressed and did everything he could for. The day of the event. She asked for money. Describing his wife's death, Meader said she came to him a little after 12. She asked for money, he said, and I promised her £1 on condition that she returned to me and the child. She said that she could not. I said I would try and get her cured. He went on, she said that she would get me disgraced and rushed at me. I had my back to the door to prevent her going out. She got me by the back of the neck, and then the pain started in my head, and I tried to pull her away, and we fell. All of a sudden, she released her grip on me. To Edward. Did you at any time try to strangle or kill her? No. Did you intend to kill her in the least? No. At this stage, the prosecution withdrew the charge of murder and suggested that the jury should study the question of manslaughter. With the medical findings casting a long shadow over the Crown's case, the momentum of the trial shifted. What had begun as a straightforward allegation of willful murder now appeared far less certain, and the prosecution, perhaps sensing the growing unease amongst the jurors, stepped back from its original position. The question was no longer one of deliberate killing, but of what precisely had happened in that brief and violent struggle, and whether Meader bore criminal responsibility for a death that might have required only the smallest degree of force. It was on that narrower ground that the jury were finally asked to make their judgment. The jury found the prisoner not guilty on the charge of manslaughter. Meader pleaded guilty to attempting to commit suicide and was bound over to come up for judgment if called upon. Sir Edward Marshall Hall, as Meader left the court, announced that St Dunstan's would look after him. By now, the Meader case had travelled far beyond the walls of the Old Bailey. The combination of a blinded ex-soldier, a troubled marriage, a sudden death, and the formidable presence of Sir Marshall Hall ensured that the story leapt from local curiosity to national headline material. Papers across the country had followed each twist with avid interest, framing it variously as a domestic tragedy, a medical puzzle, or a stark illustration of the difficulties facing returning servicemen. So when the verdict finally came, it was reported not as a quiet courtroom footnote, but as a matter of broad public attention, splashed across the pages. From the Daily Mirror on the 8th of September 1922, blind man acquitted. Story of wife's death during struggle. Murder charge fails. Accused of murdering his wife during a quarrel, Alfred Arthur Meader, a blind ex-soldier of Balham, was at the Old Bailey yesterday found not guilty and discharged. It was stated that Meader became blind as a result of war injuries. His wife left him early this year and on July the 12th called to see him at his house. She was found dead later, and Meader afterwards attempted to cut his throat. Medical evidence was that Mrs. Meader had an unusually large thymus gland, which would render her liable to suffocation. Meader denied that he had attempted to strangle her, saying that in a struggle they both fell, he on top. He did not realise at first that she was dead. Meader was afterwards charged with attempting to commit suicide, to which he pleaded guilty and was bound over. The Meader case slipped from the headlines as quickly as it had entered them, overshadowed by newer scandals and fresher tragedies, as newspapers invariably do. Alfred Meader, acquitted of his wife's death but still bound over for attempting to take his own life, stepped back into a world that had not been kind to him, even before the events of that July afternoon. St Dunstan's kept their promise, offering continued support, but the fractures left behind, the loss of Mabel, the upheaval in their young daughter's life, and the lingering uncertainty of what truly happened in that brief, fatal struggle could not be so easily mended. Cases like this one reveal much about the era in which they occurred. They show us a Britain still grappling with the long shadow of the Great War, men damaged in body and mind, women navigating new freedom and old expectations, and institutions straining to understand domestic tragedies through the limited frameworks available to them. In that context, blame often settled almost along predictable lines, and complexity was more easily flattened than examined. What remains is a story which nobody truly won, and in which the truth, the precise truth, may never be fully known. Yet it offers a window into the pressure of a post-war household, the fragile boundary between quarrel and catastrophe, and the way a single moment can alter the course of several lives. As ever, these echoes from the past remind us that history is not only made in parliaments and battlefields, but in small rooms, private tensions, and the quiet struggles that seldom make the official record. And in that sense, the Meader case is as revealing as any grander tale, a glimpse into ordinary lives lived under extraordinary strain. Further particulars. As we often discover in this corner of British history, the law was not always preoccupied with murder, treason, or even the occasional bout of arsenic. Quite often, Parliament and the local authorities busied themselves with matters far more pressing, such as how young girls wore their hair and whether Londoners were keeping pigs at a socially acceptable distance. It seemed that while the courts wrestled with the great questions of guilt and innocence, the lawmakers of the day were equally determined to ensure that no girl under 16 put her hair up too early and that no pig came within 40 yards of a respectable London thoroughfare. One cannot help but suspect that national stability was believed to rest somewhere between a neatly plaited schoolgirl and a well-behaved pig. With that in mind, here are two perfectly wonderfully peculiar examples of British lawmaking, the sort that reminds us that history is never short of surprises, even outside the murder docket. From the Daily Mirror, the 19th of July, 1922, protecting girls under 16. KC MP wants law to make them wear their hair down. That the defence, she looked older, shall not be available to offenders, and that the age of consent shall be 16 years, has now been decided by a standing committee of the House of the Criminal Law Amendment Bill. Mr. Marquiston KC, the coalition and unionist member for Springburn in Glasgow, has now given notice to move the following clause. Every female of the age of 16 years or under that age shall wear her hair either loose or plaited down her back, and any female who is of the age of 16 or under that age who shall wear her hair up shall be liable to the penalties of this act, and upon a third conviction shall be confined in a borstal institution until they have reached the age of 16 years. From the worlds of 1922, with politicians attempting to regulate a girl's appearance, we go back in time to a statute in London regarding that most noble of creatures, the pig. Under the Metropolitan Police Act of 1839, Section 60, Londoners were officially forbidden from keeping pigs within 40 yards of a public street unless they held special permission from the police commissioner. The law was meant to prevent noisome smells and unwholesome effluvia, which, as the 1849 Westminster case revealed, was rather ironic, given that the parish left an open sewer running directly in front of the pig styles, while insisting the animals were the nuisance. This case took place in the heart of London in Chelsea, is one such example. From the Sun, London, the 19th September 1849, Westminster. A number of pig jobbers living in the neighbourhood of the court appeared to a summons obtained against them by direction of the parish authorities for keeping swine within 40 yards of a public thoroughfare or place. It having been clearly proved by Richard Gamble, Inspector of Nuisances from the Tot Hill Fields Trustees, in the case of a man named Taylor, which was first called on, that there were 35 pigs kept in his yard within the prohibited distance. In the course of a very lengthened cross-examination by Mr. Gillam, who conducted the case for the defendants, it was admitted by the two witnesses, both of whom held situations in the parish, that pigs had been kept in Bull's Yard for a great number of years. And although there were 150 persons living there, they, the witnesses, had never heard of their being visited with illness, that no person in Bull's Gardens, although many did not keep pigs, had ever made any complaint of nuisance, that there was no person in attendance who resided in the neighbourhood to complain before the magistrates, and that the two persons who had signed the formal notice to that effect as required by the statute, both lived more than a furlong off. It was further elicited that there was an open sewer from which night soil and other matter discharged itself, running in front of the whole of the houses in Bull's Garden, close to the piggeries, and that it sometimes smelt very offensively, and both witnesses admitted that no steps had been taken to remedy that. For the defence, a vast number of the pig dealers and others were called, who declared that the styes were washed out 3 or 4 times a day, and that there was not the slightest offensive smell caused by the pigs, but the ditch or sewer should have been the subject of complaint. Themselves and families, they declared, enjoyed capital health. They informed the magistrate that keeping pigs was their sole means of existence, and added that, if not permitted to do this, they must, with their families, go into the workhouse. Mr. Burrell said he had paid a personal visit to the place in order to judge for himself. In the opinion of Lord Ellenborough, a nuisance must be something that would cause the life of others to be uncomfortable, but he could find nothing in the case which came within that denomination. It was not certainly such a place as those accustomed to the luxuries of life would select, but his inspection of the buildings afforded him the opportunity of stating that they exhibited the utmost cleanliness. There was no smell from the pigsties at 2 yards distance, nor was the effluvia such as could be deemed injurious to health. The persons and their families appeared in good health, and those toward the end of the buildings who did not keep pigs made no complaint whatever of being inconvenienced or annoyed by them. His opinion, from the result of personal inspection, was clearly that it was not a nuisance, nor was there anything improper in it, and he therefore dismissed the whole of the complaints. The decision was hailed with a burst of applause from a crowded auditory. And that, dear listeners, brings us to the end of tonight's tale. Right on cue, the old grandfather clock in the hallway has begun tolling the hour, a gentle indication that even the furniture believes we've said quite enough for one evening. If you've enjoyed our wander through the shadows, do consider supporting the channel in whichever way you feel moved. A like, a share, a comment, or simply pressing whatever mysterious button YouTube has chosen to display to you. They all help more than you think. And if you'd like even more, our Patreon awaits, where we cheerfully upload 6 times a week and proudly host over 850 of our own documentaries, more than half of it exclusive to members, all for the price of a disappointing petrol station coffee, but with considerably fewer regrets attached. This has been News of the Times, and I am Robin Coles, amateur cobblestone navigator, part-time archivist of Victorian oddities, and a reluctant interpreter of historical moral panics. Wishing you a peaceful evening, and we'll see you next time on News of the Times, where the cobblestone streets always remain just a little bit murky.